Hello everybody, for years I have been trying to crack the nut that is Volkswagen UK PR. You might think that because I've been in with Audi for some time now, getting in with VW would be nice and simple. However, nothing could be further from the truth. Happily, I can now say that I am indeed in with VW PR, and when they asked me what car it was from them that I wanted to try first, there was only one thing on my mind: the Phaeton. Sadly, they don't actually have a Phaeton in their heritage collection, so instead I went with something newer. Another car which has been puzzling me for quite a bit: the Arteon. I first became aware of the Arteon when I saw it in a cinema advertisement about 5 years ago, and at that time I thought, wow, that's a great looking car. It was the saloon back then, in that sort of launch phoenix yellowish type colour, and I thought, wow, is this the new Phaeton, or perhaps a version of the A6? This definitely seems to be an upmarket VW. That's how they were portraying it. So you can imagine my confusion when I then went home and checked, and it turned out to be really just a sort of upmarket, slightly newer Passat CC. However, that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It is on the inside where the Arteon is at both its best and its worst. The overall layout is pretty decent, and there's a mixture of materials, some very nice, like this upgraded Napa leather seat. I also quite like the colour of it actually. The leather on the steering wheel. Also, all Arteons have either real metal or wood inside them, but then you have the usual sort of now feeling quite old, even though it isn't VW switchgear. You've got a virtual cockpit here which they've made sure seems just a little bit smaller than the one that Audi get, and the usual modern frustrations. You have a big touch display up top here that I can just about accept, but what I don't like is the Hvac panel down here. Now, some manufacturers have just gone full touchscreen on those, and that I hate, and VW have tried something a little bit different, for which I suppose I should applaud them, but what they've tried is stupid, because many of the major controls now are touch sensitive. So you want to turn the fan up on the inside of the cabin, you got to swipe along. Same for temperature. In fact, it's even the same for many of the buttons on the steering wheel, and you encounter pretty much the same problem that I had with the Ferrari Roma. You see, buttons are great. Physical buttons are amazing because, especially for steering wheel ones, you can feel where they are, you know what button you've got your hand on, you can activate it without having to take your eyes off the road. But the moment you make this all a sort of fairly indistinct feeling, touch-sensitive affair, you have to look at it to work out what you're doing, because if you don't, and you're trying to just drag your finger across it to find out where your volume button is, you are going to inadvertently be activating all the other settings on the car. And this, to me, just seems like a bit of a design fail. It's something that you can tell somebody invented when they were sat still in a lab, not going anywhere. They didn't design this thing for people that were actually driving, and that does annoy me. As does this airbag cover, because it's one of the things you're going to wind up spending a lot of time looking at, especially if you're stuck in traffic, and the material on it is just bizarre. This car has somewhat Audi-like vents, all the AC and everything of course works perfectly, it's German. You've got a very curious heads-up display too, which I initially was a bit unsure about, but I actually rather like, and it's got plenty of adjustment in it, so you can always make sure that you can see it nicely. These seats are spectacular, and honestly, from here on, this car gets really, really very good, because these are comfortable. This is the upgraded Ergo Comfort 14-way adjustable driver's seat with, as mentioned, nicer leather. It's got a massage function which actually has some real shove into it, and there is boatloads of room in this car. Seriously, rear passengers get sort of approaching executive saloon levels of room, and the boot is enormous. There is loads of space in this car, so you can happily take you and the family to the airport, to school, wherever it is that you need to go, and trust me, you're going to be able to fit everything in. It doesn't take long to realise why people are seeing the Arteon shooting brake, along with the Golf 8, as the hot ticket in VW land. That being said, Arteons have never really sold in great quantities, accounting for about 1% of UK VW sales. Lack of a panoramic roof aside, I really love this car. Not so keen on the wheels, but we'll get onto those in a moment. This is the Elegance trim. the entry level more or less, and it comes with pretty much the most basic engine too, a 150 horsepower diesel mated to a 7-speed DSG gearbox. Now that's capable of about 57 miles to the gallon, and of course there are other choices of power plant. The most popular one, surprisingly, is the 190 horsepower petrol, and that surprises me because VW say around 2/3 of Arteon customers are fleet sales, so businesses. It turns out that even they are eschewing the black fuel. However, look a little closer at the spec sheet of this car and there is something that worries me. You see, in theory, the Arteon has a pretty easy job. All it needs to do is to get you, your passengers and all of your luggage from A to B comfortably, quietly and relatively economically. And then you look here and you see things like 15mm lowered sports suspension, 20-inch rims with air stop tyres, and that sounds rather like run flats to me, although they are not. And then you find the price. Are you ready for this one? As standard, the on-the-road figure of this car, £38,865. But on top of the wheels and the suspension, we also have some extra stuff. You've got the fancy driver's seat, and that's not cheap. You've got the nicer leather, you've got a tow bar, you've got posh headlights, you've got a heads-up display, and double glazing. Oh yes, pillarless doors with double glazing. That's really cute, but all of these things do rack up the price, and you wind up with a 150 horsepower diesel that carries a list price of just over £47,000. Suddenly, this car becomes somewhat difficult to justify, especially when you have the concern that VW have done what so many manufacturers do. They take a nice, decent, comfortable car and then they stick sport suspension on it, sporty wheels, sporty tyres, and they completely and totally ruin it. So with the Arteon, should I be worried? In short, no. Mercifully, the Arteon is an absolutely fabulous car to drive. I've got a lot of nice stuff on the driveway at the moment. I got the Ferrari, got the Lamborghini, got the Honda. There's all sorts been coming through. And yet still, I found myself subconsciously reaching for the VW keys, because this thing is exactly how a normal car should be. I was really worried that those big wheels and that lowered suspension would mean this thing would just crash its way all down the road in a manner that everyone thinks is sporty, but in fact is just annoying. No, nothing could be further from the truth. Now you can feel this suspension having to work overtime to account for those larger wheels. I personally would go with either the standard 18s that you get with the Elegance trim or the upgraded 19s, which are about the only style of wheel I actually like the look of. And it's not a car entirely without fault, not at all. The engine is actually really very good. Only 150 horsepower, but it's pretty strong, has a good spread of torque, and again, as a sort of boring car engine, does the job very well, is quite responsive, but the gearbox isn't always so helpful. Most of the time, it's absolutely fine. Generally speaking, you don't notice it. But there are occasions where the whole thing does get its knickers in a twist. This isn't Arteon specific. This tends to be the case with any modern turbocharged engine and dual clutch gearbox. Every once in a while, you'll go to move away and you'll put your foot down, and for a couple of seconds, nothing will happen. While it decides what gear it wants to be in, gets the turbo spooling, there's lots that has to happen in order for you to move forwards, and sometimes that process is a little bit more laborious than you'd like it to be. It's a large car, but it's very easy to place on the road, and because the suspension is nice and supple, you can make good progress without disturbing your passengers in the back. This is one of my old Alpine handling routes. It's actually pretty rough. I tend only to use it now for drive-by shots, but this car is taking it absolutely brilliantly. I know that the inside of this road is really rough. It's got a lot of dips and bumps in it. This is fabulous. It's also eerily quiet. Now, for some reason, you've only got the double glazing in the front. The rear just makes do with a fairly thick piece of glass, but it works quite well. Unfortunately, this car's also been specified with the privacy glass, which I think makes the rear feel just a little bit gloomy. A shame, really. These seats I absolutely love, and as a package, this is a car I could easily do some serious mileage in on a regular basis without needing to worry. My girlfriend's family are currently looking for something new to replace their old faithful Avensis, and it's the London to Scotland car. They work in London, they sometimes live in Scotland, and they frequently go between the two. This is a 460-mile journey each way, so you need something that's fairly frugal, fairly nice, and is going to be very comfortable. This is the perfect car, especially if you've got to move lots of stuff or a few people. It's the ideal thing to do that job. Now, you can change gear yourself, but there's not really an awful lot of point in doing that with this particular engine. I do want to give VW kudos though for having a gear lever that actually moves. This is becoming something of a rarity now, and honestly I don't know why, because to me having a gear lever that moves depending on what mode you want it to be in is really a safety thing. Yet the new style of lever, they're no nicer to use, they're far more confusing, and actually they've been involved in a lot of serious accidents. So why manufacturers persevere with them, I do not know. The stereo in here is also not spectacular. This is the base one. You can get an upgraded Harman Kardon, and that I definitely would have. The IQ headlights are a bit of a mixed bag. On occasion they're brilliant, they're very clear, you can see a good distance, but they do get quite easily confused by other traffic. If you're following another road user, I found that it'll kind of activate and deactivate its side light just a bit too much, and I think that's going to be very distracting for the car in front. So unfortunately I'm not in love with those. Other manufacturers, Audi, Mercedes, BMW, seem to do that just a little bit better. It is a car that relaxes me greatly, this. I have had some fun with it, I have pushed it down a few roads, but honestly you can do it. There's just no point to it. This is actually a car I'm very happy not even doing the speed limit in, and I think that's important. If you are going to have a day-to-day car, it's a good thing to have. There is still a question though hanging over this car, which is, what is an Arteon? Let's be honest here, like what actually is it? How does this separate itself from the other cars, not just in the VW range, but the Hvac range in general? Why would you buy this over an Audi A4? Why would you buy it over, say, the Skoda Superb? Now, the Superb, I think, has even more space in the back, so as a practical thing, is very nice. But this does feel like a much better place to be, and so it bleeding should for the money that VW want. This is more money, I think, than the old Superb 4x4 280, which essentially had the Golf R engine in it. But this does feel like it is the more upmarket car inside. I also have it on good authority from my man in the know, and I shall simply call him the Mole, that you can get a good sort of 15% off any VW list price. Because let's be honest here, at £47,000, this is a very hard sell. It's a lovely car, and it's very easy for us journo types to say, yes, it's brilliant, lovely, you should definitely buy it. But when it's not our money, it's very easy to spend. If it were your own, I think you'd be struggling. However, if you could get this to just under 40,000 quid, that then I think becomes somewhat more palatable. 50 odd grand for the top of the line Arteon would just about make sense to me. I think that's a car that I could get on board with. You can, of course, get 4Motion all-wheel drive on some of the nicer cars, and I suppose that's a bonus for some. The steering is a bit of an oddball. It's totally and completely silent. It does not talk to you whatsoever. But it's got a reasonable weighting, it's fairly direct, you can tell the car what to do, and it's actually quite a nice thing to drive. That engine is more responsive than you'd think if you catch it at the right moment. Brakes are decent, and you can tell this is, of course, like all VW products, something that has been honed and refined to be rather good. If I were ever in a position to just be buying an ordinary, normal, quote-unquote, boring car, this would be something that I would consider. I am actually on the hunt for a new daily driver, but this is being excluded simply on the basis that it's going to depreciate a lot, and I don't really fancy that. That's just me. What's the turning circle like? Let's find out. Not bad, not awful. It's a big car, this. It doesn't feel like it. You get some really cool touches too. I love the rear view camera, which is hidden under the VW logo. Why don't more cars do that? That's a genius piece of design, means it isn't completely and totally filthy when you come to use it. So I've established that the Arteon is a good car. A little bit expensive, but good. What actually is it? I mean, how can I describe this car to somebody? How can I explain your reasoning to buy this over an Audi A4? Well, it's taken me quite some time, but I think now I've just about worked it out. This is a cool taxi. The word taxi may seem there a little bit derogatory, but please believe me, I am not using it in such a context. This is an absolutely superb way to get people and their things from A to B. As a car, as a basic car, this is brilliant. It also feels a little bit different. Despite being a VW, because these don't sell in huge numbers, it'll always have that slight air of exclusivity that an A4 won't. But you can, of course, still get all your usual VW things if you're so inclined. You know, you get your same dealers, you get your same service network, you get all of that jazz. You get familiar interiors if you are a VW person, but you fancy something just a little bit off the beaten track. This is a great car. I mean, I really do mean that. This is sensational as an ordinary, normal thing, which is probably the most important kind of car that there is. This car is reminding me of that old, and if you haven't seen it, amazing documentary From A to B, Tales of Modern Motoring. The episode on company car drivers in particular. And this would be the sort of car that the cool guy bought, because he didn't want the usual thing. He didn't want the ordinary car. He didn't want the Golf Estate or the Vauxhall Insignia Tour or whatever it is. I don't really know what. Frankly, I'm quite amazed that VW persevere with making estate cars, because it is a dying marketplace. And I'm so glad that they do, because honestly, the vast majority of people that I know who have SUVs, this would suit them far better. I would really like to see VW do a few more cars like this, only with sensible HVAC controls and proper buttons on the steering wheel, please. I know you're trying, and I applaud you for trying, but it didn't work. Can we please go back to how it was? Thank you for attending my TED Talk. Bye-bye.